Okay, let's jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are taking on the absolute heaviest hitter in modern global politics, the rivalry between the United States and China. Look, this is a massive, sprawling topic, but over the next 20 minutes, we're going to distill this down into a highly focused, deep dive masterclass. Because this relationship, it's not just about politicians making speeches or military posturing. It literally dictates the cost of the smartphone you're holding, the flow of global trade, and the very future of artificial intelligence. It's the defining geopolitical competition of our time. To make sense of all this, we're going to break it down into 5 key pillars. First, a new kind of rivalry. Second, the tech and trade war. Third, Taiwan and military flashpoints. Fourth, the global influence battle. And finally, future scenarios for 2026. Let's get started. Pillar number 1, a new kind of rivalry. We are moving from the old Cold War model to something called competitive coexistence. You hear it all the time in the news, right? People love calling this a new Cold War. But honestly, that comparison doesn't totally work. Think about the US and the Soviet Union back in the day. They operated in 2 completely isolated economic bubbles. They basically didn't trade with each other at all. But today, the US and China traded almost $600 billion worth of goods last year alone. It's a staggering amount of money. Scholars call this competitive coexistence. It basically means we're living in a world where these 2 superpowers are locked in a fierce, intense rivalry, while at the exact same time, their economies are deeply, deeply interconnected. It's a giant puzzle. So how did we even get to this point? Let's do a quick rewind. In 1949, the Communist Revolution established the People's Republic of China. And for decades, the US just flat out refused to recognize the new government. Total hostility. But then, a massive pivot. President Richard Nixon visits China in 1972, completely flipping the script on international politics. By 1978, Deng Xiaoping rolls out these massive economic reforms, finally opening China's doors to foreign investment. And the results? Truly unprecedented. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty as China rapidly morphed into the world's manufacturing hub. This eventually led to formal diplomatic recognition in 1979. Now, back then, American policymakers kind of assumed that all this economic integration would just naturally lead to political liberalization in China. But as we know, that didn't happen. China kept its one-party system, continued its lightning-fast modernization, and, well, that set the stage for the friction we're seeing right now. Moving on to Pillar 2, the tech and trade war. This is all about AI, semiconductors, and a concept known as de-risking. Okay, so you might have heard the word decoupling being thrown around lately, making it sound like the US and China are getting a complete economic divorce. But actually, scratch that. It's more like de-risking. What's happening is major global companies, think of giants like Apple, are moving a slice of their manufacturing away from China and into countries like India, Vietnam, Mexico, or Indonesia. Why? Well, it's a mix of US tariffs, export controls, and China's own push to be totally self-sufficient. Companies are basically looking at the geopolitical map and saying, hey, we need to restructure our supply chains so we aren't completely reliant on just one country. The goal here isn't to totally cut off highly profitable ties with China, but rather to just cushion the blow in case a major geopolitical shock hits. And right at the center of this economic shift is the chip war. Look, semiconductors are literally the foundational building blocks of the modern world. They power everything, and I mean everything, from the smartphone in your hand to next-gen AI to hypersonic missiles. Now, here's a crazy fact. Over 90% of the world's most advanced chips are made by just one single company in Taiwan. 90%. So the US is aggressively using export controls to cut off China's access to these top-tier semiconductors, trying to deliberately hit the brakes on their tech advancements. And China's response? They are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into their own domestic chip factories to become totally self-reliant. Make no mistake, whoever wins the semiconductor race holds the ultimate trump card in the 21st century. Which brings us perfectly to artificial intelligence, what a lot of experts are calling the next industrial revolution. Both of these nations are heavyweights here, but they have very different advantages. The US is leading the pack with absolute powerhouse companies like OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic. Plus, they've got the top research universities and just massive pools of venture capital funding. But don't count China out for a second. Their advantages are equally intense. They have access to unimaginably massive data sets, incredibly strong financial backing from the government, and this relentless focus on taking AI out of the lab and rapidly integrating it into real-world stuff like smart manufacturing and robotics. It is a neck-and-neck sprint, and whoever pulls ahead is going to have massive sway over the global economy. That brings us to our third pillar, Taiwan and military flashpoints, and the classic security dilemma. So let's talk about Taiwan.
It is widely considered by analysts to be the single most dangerous geopolitical hotspot on Earth right now. But why are the stakes so incredibly high? Well, Taiwan is a self-governing democracy, complete with its own government and its own booming economy. But crucially, tying back to what we just talked about, it is the absolute epicenter of advanced semiconductor manufacturing. So if a conflict were to break out over Taiwan, we aren't just talking about a localized tragedy. We're talking about global trade routes freezing up, major world powers getting dragged into a military conflict, and a total paralysis of the tech supply chains that literally keep our modern world running. Because of these wild stakes, the U.S. walks this incredibly fine diplomatic tightrope called strategic ambiguity. It's exactly what it sounds like. Officially, Washington does not recognize Taiwan as an independent state. But at the same time, it maintains super strong unofficial ties and firmly supports Taiwan's military defenses by selling them weapons. It's a calculated balancing act. And this sits in direct, stark contrast to China's official stated position that Taiwan is a province of China and that reunification with the mainland is inevitable. While Beijing says they definitely prefer a peaceful reunification, they have explicitly not ruled out using military force to make it happen. When you zoom out and look at the whole Indo-Pacific region, the contrasting military setups are fascinating. Over the past 20 years, China has completely overhauled its military. I mean, rapid modernization. They're churning out aircraft carriers, developing hypersonic missiles, vastly expanding their navy, and pushing hard into space tech. On the flip side, the U.S. is relying on its established, globally spanning infrastructure. We're talking bases everywhere, unmatched air power, and a really tight network of regional alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. And here's the tricky part. It creates a classic security dilemma. When one country builds up its military, even if they claim it's purely for defense, the other side looks at it and goes, no, that's a threat, and builds up their own forces in response. It's a dangerous spiral.
All right, Pillar 4, the global influence battle, competing for the global south. This rivalry has essentially turned the entire developing world into a giant chessboard. On one side, you have China pushing its Belt and Road Initiative. This is a massive, incredibly ambitious strategy where China is bankrolling huge infrastructure projects. We're talking railways, deep water ports, massive highways, and energy grids all across Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. It's a huge flex of economic power. In response, the U.S. and its allies are rushing to offer alternative development partnerships. Their pitch? They emphasize financial transparency, democratic governance, and long-term economic sustainability, trying to warn countries away from taking on massive Chinese debt. But here is the really fascinating twist to all this. The global south, they aren't just pawns on this board. They are playing the game too. Countries like India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia are actively carving out totally independent foreign policies. They are more than happy to accept investments, trade deals, and technology from both Washington and Beijing without formally allying with either. They're refusing to pick a side. This dynamic is completely reshaping the globe, pulling us away from a simple two-sided world into a highly complex, multipolar environment where smaller nations suddenly have a ton of leverage. Yet, honestly, despite all this intense geopolitical chess, there's one thing that is forcing their hands: climate change. The reality is, the US and China are the two largest greenhouse gas emitters on the entire planet. So it's kind of ironic. They're locked in this fierce, high-stakes competition, but any global goals regarding our food security, our water resources, or the transition to green energy, it's literally impossible to pull off unless these two rivals actually sit down at a table and cooperate. It is a very stark reminder that even the fiercest geopolitical rivalry has to eventually bow to the practical reality of global survival. And finally, Pillar 5, future scenarios for 2026. Where do we go from here? When experts look at this incredibly complex relationship, they generally map out 4 possible paths forward. First is managed competition. This is the ideal scenario where both sides still compete aggressively, but they keep diplomatic channels wide open and completely avoid armed conflict. Then there's economic separation. This is a world where trade falls off a cliff and the US and China build entirely separate, independent global supply chains. The third path, and the one world leaders lose sleep over, is a military crisis, a catastrophic escalation over a flashpoint like Taiwan or the South China Sea. And finally, there's selective cooperation. This is a messy but realistic mix where intense rivalry happens in tech and military spaces, but they practically collaborate on existential threats like climate change, global pandemics, or financial stability.
So, after exploring all of this over the last 20 minutes, here is the crucial question we have to ask ourselves. Which of these four scenarios is actually going to happen? Because make no mistake, the decisions being hashed out right now in Washington and Beijing are going to define everything, from the technology sitting in our living rooms to the fundamental security of the entire international order. Which path will they take? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to use the facts to understand the incredible forces shaping our world.